In his book Remember Death, Matthew McCullough says this: "When the reality of death is far from our minds, the promises of Jesus often seem detached from our lives." Over the past 7 weeks, death and his rates have been constantly in our newsfeed. We've tried to stay home and avoid death. And when we have ventured out, we've crossed over the road to limit death's power. For the very first time in my life, death has been on the forefront of our nation's consciousness. It's not without reason that I've grown up in a culture that tries to hide and limit death. Death is ugly. It numbs satisfaction of pleasure, wealth, and success. It brings the promising career to a crashing halt. It stops all the clocks. And ultimately, it is our greatest enemy that we can't escape. Despite our best efforts, that world-famous line in the prayer of committal, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," rings true. God returns the children of Adam to dust. This time of crisis has pulled the rug from under our feet. We've come face to face with our great enemy. In his commentary on the Psalms, Derek Kidner says this: "Psalm 90 has established itself as a prayer supremely matched to times of crisis." Psalm 90 is a prayer for today. And what we need in times of crisis is wisdom. At the heart of Psalm 90 is a cry for a heart of wisdom. In the face of mortality, Psalm 90 looks to the immortal God for a heart of wisdom. In Psalm 90, we're not only reminded of our frailty, but we're given a reason for our mortality. It's there in verses 7 to 10. As children of Adam, we are sinners under the wrath of God. Now, there's no more unpalatable truth in popular 21st century thought than this. The world around us tells us that we're born morally good, and so the idea of original sin is not just too pessimistic, it's actually unpalatable to our ears. But more than that, if there is a God, and he's there, then we deserve his acceptance and not his anger. But when the bell tolls, we still need a reason for our mortality. And the Bible's answer is there in verse 8. Our iniquities are set before him, the God who made the heavens and the earth. The uncomfortable truth is that we deserve God's anger. Now, God's anger is not like my flying off the handle. You see, God's anger is both just and it's overwhelming. Because of God's wrath at our sin, our span of life is numbered at 70 or 80 years, and that span is marked with toil and trouble. With that realism and reason in mind, what does wisdom look like in a time of crisis? Well, verses 11 and 12 give us the answer. It is to fear the Lord. And that is the heart of wisdom. And that would come as no surprise to those of us who know Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But what does it look like to fear the Lord in a time of crisis? Well, the answer comes in verse 13. Verse 13 says this: "Return, O Lord, how long?" Christopher Ash calls this the cry of covenant faith. It's seeking the Lord to have pity on his servants. It's a cry for compassion from the covenant God. That compassion brings satisfaction in God's covenant love in the face of death. Even though we deserve to be isolated from God forever, in his steadfast love we are not cut off from him. And that truth truly satisfies. It brings satisfaction, it brings joy. A joy that outweighs even the most evil or afflicted times. Later, the Apostle Paul will say that our sufferings, any sufferings now, will be far outweighed by the glory that is to come. It brings knowledge of God's saving work that ends the reign of death. We have that victory. But it also brings purpose. Verse 17, the purpose of our hands the labour of our hands will last. These promises need to be reattached to our lives now, but also when we come out the other side of COVID-19. Psalm 90 is a prayer that God's people have used through the generations. First, they were led in this prayer by Moses, the man of God, who led his people praying this in times of crisis during the wilderness years. The psalmist then placed it here in the Psalter at the beginning of Book 4 to be prayed during the exile. The men of God would lead God's people in praying it in their times of crisis. But supremely, it's a prayer of the Lord Jesus, leading his exiled church in prayer. It's a prayer that we, as we number our days, can join in with.